What happens when a powerful millionaire, certain of his superiority, decides to mock a humble waitress in a foreign language he believes she never understand? In a room full of politicians, investors, and executives, he laughs confident no one will catch his words. But then, something unbelievable happens. The waitress turns, looks him in the eye, and answers back in flawless Russian. What she says next doesn't just silence the table, it changes everything. The laugh rolled off his tongue as he tossed out a few words in Russian, certain no one at the table or in the room would catch the innuendo. Up here, 48 floors above the financial district, the city spread out like a jeweled grid. Bridges stitched the rivers. Ferries drew chalky wakes across the harbor. Glass towers caught the last orange of sunset. The restaurant Apex sold three things: a view that made power feel inevitable, a hush that protected secrets, and a clientele that treated status like a second skin. Richard Monroe fit the place like a custom suit. Son of a manufacturing magnate and a corporate litigator, he'd inherited a company, doubled it, then doubled it again by the time he hit 39. He spoke 3 languages, curated a ruthlessly calm demeanor, and had the kind of charm people mistook for kindness until they hit a boundary and found only steel. Investors praised him. Rivals feared him. Assistants learned to decode his silences. Tonight his table hosted 2 American executives and a senior senator from Pennsylvania, a man with a practiced smile and hair the color of old steel. They were talking foreign capital, port expansions, energy incentives, every sentence smooth, every chuckle measured. Rick turned his wine glass by the stem, letting the Pinot cling in a thin, elegant sheet. "The numbers I showed you are conservative," he said, as if pointing out the weather. 30% minimum over 18 months. If the permitting track clears the way I expect, we're closer to 42. The senator leaned in. "You've never been accused of sandbagging, Rick. I still remember you projecting 15 on that Newark logistics upgrade and delivering 28. Pleasant humility. It landed the way such lines were designed to land, a compliment that disguised complicity. Smiles circled the table, a ritual exchange of assurance. Deals, real ones, were built like this, on optics that looked like confidence and felt like inevitability. She arrived then, cutting through the low glow of table lamps and the white noise of expensive conversation. Unlike the other servers, polished, model gorgeous, rehearsed to invisibility, she drew the eye without asking for it. Precision in her steps, calm in her shoulders, almond dark eyes, light skin that caught the copper warmth of the room. The name tag on her black vest read simply, Elena, no last name. She filled the senator's glass first, eased a clean pour for the executives, then reached Rick's. He watched the angle of her wrist, the steady hand, the quiet focus. He felt the adolescent urge to puncture the moment, to place himself at the center of it the way he always did, with a joke, a flex, a demonstration that the world belonged to those who were unembarrassed to claim it. "This vintage reminds me of one I tried in St. Petersburg," he said lightly, letting the geography hang like a lure. Then, with a sideways glance at her and a smile tailored to seem harmless, he said in Russian, soft enough to pass as private, crude enough in its undertone to be unmistakable to any native speaker, a compliment about her hands that, to English ears, would sound like courtly flattery and nothing more. He waited a beat, savoring his own cleverness. Her reply came in Russian, fluent, crisp, unhurried. "Thank you for the compliment to my hands, sir, but I prefer you admire the quality of service, not parts of my body. If you'd like recommendations for actual Russian wines, I'll be happy to suggest some next time." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The table felt the air change, even if they didn't understand the syllable. Rick, who always had a second line chambered, found the chamber empty. For 2 stupidly long seconds, he just stared. She finished his pour, gave the slightest nod, professional, not apologetic, and moved on. Conversation limped forward, then gathered itself like a runner after a stumble. The executives chuckled about supply chains. The senator cracked a line about port dredging. Rick mirrored the cues, signed a preliminary term sheet, even delivered a small practice story about his father's first warehouse in Kearney. But his mind kept returning to the server who had corrected him in the gentlest possible voice, and still somehow managed to turn a pillar of him to sand. It wasn't humiliation, at least not the public kind he'd seen ruin men. It was the surgical neatness of it. No scene, no raised voice. Just boundaries, stated with the kind of poise that suggested she'd had to set them more than once, and had learned how to do it without bleeding. When the senator excused himself and the executives followed, Rick lingered, flipping pages in a leather folio, as if hunting a clause he already knew by heart. He ordered vodka Russian, top shelf, predictably, and asked the bartender, casual as weather, "Is Elena still on?" "Closes most nights," the bartender said, polishing a glass. The look that came with it said more than the words. "She draws attention." Don't be the story. Rick disliked that the thought bothered him. Disliked more that it mattered. He left a tip that would embarrass anyone, but a man like him, and rode the elevator down to the third lobby of polished stone and water walls. Outside, the June air was clean for once, scrubbed by a day-long rain. The towers gleamed like they'd been newly unwrapped. In the back of his car, Manhattan rolled by in rivered light, but his head stayed on the 48th floor, on a woman with a steady wrist, and a sentence that had landed like a lesson. Morning came gray and flat. He ate alone on his balcony in Tribeca, coffee cooling, the Hudson a sheet of tarnished metal. His assistant, Christine, arrived with the day's map, 3 meetings, 1 investor lunch, a late call with a Singapore fund. He agreed to all of it, then canceled the lunch mid-sentence, surprising both of them. "Tell them a family matter," he said. "You don't cancel lunches," Christine replied. "Not as a correction, but as a record of fact. I did today." Work behaved the way it always did for him, like a machine that ran as long as he kept pressure on the right levers. Contracts were reviewed. A litigation update was neutralized with a single phone call and a favor he was owed. But there was static in his signal now, a background hum that pulled his concentration back to the previous night. That evening, he returned to Apex alone and chose a table angled toward the city, not the room. When Elena approached, there was the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes before the professional mask settled into place. "Good evening, sir. Welcome back to Apex." "Good evening, Elena," he said. "You have an excellent memory for faces. It's part of the job. Not cold. Not warm. Accurate." "Rick," he offered. "Please, what may I bring you tonight, Mr. Monroe?" She'd heard the preference and set it gently aside. He ordered a drink he didn't particularly want, and, when she returned with it, stayed where he was. "No smirk, no Russian. No game. I owe you an apology," he said. "My comment the other night was inappropriate." "I'm sorry. Apology accepted," she said, setting the glass precisely on the coaster. She didn't give him the mercy of a smile. She didn't give him the punishment of a lecture. She gave him closure and distance. He should have left it there. He almost did. "Your Russian is flawless," he said, and felt how clumsy the word sounded in a room designed to sand clumsiness off men like him. "It's rare to hear it at that level. I was raised with it," she said. "Anything else for you?" He nodded and she moved on. The room enveloped him again, the chime of flatware, the discreet choreography of money. He opened his phone, closed it, opened it again. An impulse he would later call a curiosity, but in truth it was habit pushed him toward information. He had people who could find anything, schools, papers, the stitched seams of a life. He told himself knowledge wasn't control. He told himself he'd be discreet. The file arrived 40 hours later, delivered the way such files always were. A concise biography scraped from public records and private skills. Elena Sokolov, 27, American, born in Brighton Beach to Russian immigrant parents. B.A. in linguistics from Columbia. M.A. in comparative literature, a B.D., then withdrawn. Fluency in 5 languages. Published essays on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in journals Rick had never heard of and would never admit he'd looked up. No debt, no legal mess. Employment history that included translation gigs and now Apex. He didn't know what he'd hoped to find: a flaw to push against, a lever to pull, a coincidence that made the story easier to tell himself. Instead, he found competence and quiet. It intrigued him more than any scandal would have. He went back again the next night, chose a table out of the main traffic lane, waited. When she approached, he kept his voice level. "I'm sorry for asking this, and you can tell me to mind my business, but why are you working nights here?" He heard it as it left his mouth and despised the shape of it. The entitlement baked into the question. Her face did not change. Her eyes did. "Have you been investigating me, Mr. Monroe?" He lied out of reflex. "No." "Then don't start." The words were soft-edged and sharp-pointed, knives wrapped in velvet. "Your apology the other night was accepted." It was not an invitation. She left, and for the second time in 2 nights, Rick found himself alone with a lesson and no clever line to erase it. He stayed until last seating, watching her work with the same unshowy efficiency as before. She never stumbled, never scowled, never pandered. It struck him that this, too, was a kind of power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself to be obeyed. He tipped well and didn't speak to her again. In the elevator, he studied his reflection in the black mirror of the closed doors and saw something he hadn't seen in years. A man uncertain of his next move, and more unsettling willing to sit in that uncertainty. Outside, the city breathed its humid June breath. Traffic pulsed. Somewhere uptown, a saxophone threaded through an open window. Rick stood for a moment under the canopy, his driver waiting at the curb, and wondered when exactly he had last wanted to know someone without also wanting to manage them. He didn't have an answer. He got in the car anyway. Sleep came in fragments that night. Twice before dawn, Rick found himself awake, city noise pressed against the glass like a tide. By morning, he sat on his balcony with a cooling cup of coffee, staring at the Hudson as if it could offer answers. Christine arrived, efficient as always, reciting his schedule: a committee call, a site inspection, an investor lunch, and a late-night conference with Singapore. He approved each item automatically, then, mid-sentence, crossed out the lunch appointment. "Family matter?" she asked, raising a brow. "Personal," he answered. It was the first time in years he'd used that word as an excuse. Instead of his usual chauffeured ride, he walked. Broadway was thick with summer humidity, vendors hissing steam over pretzels, a boy pounding rhythms on plastic buckets, sirens slicing through the avenue. He slipped into the Strand bookstore, letting the stack swallow him. Russian literature. Translation studies. A thin volume of Akhmatova with a handmade bookmark. A Norton edition of Crime and Punishment. A worn paperback of Chekhov that still smelled faintly of cigarettes. He carried them all to the register, and the cashier gave him an odd grin, as if a Wall Street executive with an armful of Russian grief was some private joke. That night, he read. Really read. Scribbling notes in the margins, circling sentences, copying lines onto a legal pad. He paused often, unsettled by how Dostoevsky's extraordinary men seemed like warped reflections of his own life. At 2 a.m, he shut the book and muttered aloud, "Don't investigate her again." The following evening he returned to Apex. He waited until the dining room thinned, until conversations were reduced to the low hum of crystal and closing checks. When Elena approached, he stood, not blocking her path, simply meeting her eye level. "I owe you another apology," he said. "Not for the words the other night, I've given you that already. For the way I handle puzzles. My instinct is to pry things open. I asked people to dig into your life. It was wrong. I won't repeat it. Her face stayed calm, but the moment warmed by a fraction. Thank you for saying it out loud, she said. Most men prefer their apologies silent. Could I ask for 10 minutes of your break? Not to perform. To listen, 10 minutes. Public place. Name it. The New York Public Library, Sunday. There's a Russian letters exhibit. 10 a.m. no entourage. No gifts. I'll be there, he promised. And for once, he met it without calculation. On Sunday, he arrived early. The marble lions outside the library wore their usual patience. Inside, under vaulted ceilings, he stood among carved author names he had never read. Jeans, a blazer his disguise of humility. Elena appeared exactly at 10. Without her server's vest, she seemed both younger and more certain. A navy skirt, white blouse, dark hair loose. No pretense, no mask, just presence. You're punctual, she said. In my world, time is the only honest currency, he replied, then winced at his own reflex. A quick smile crossed her lips. Come on. The exhibit wound through a corridor of glass cases and old photographs. Immigrants on docks, typewriters in dim apartments, leaflets from Brighton Beach bookstores. My grandparents came with 2 suitcases, she explained. One for clothes, one for books. My grandfather always said language is the one country no state can occupy. They paused before a case on Akhmatova. Rick spoke quietly. I read her last night. I didn't understand everything, but I felt it, the way grief becomes geometry. Her eyes softened for the first time. That's not bad. Even if you borrowed the geometry from your spreadsheets, he laughed. Genuinely. They moved from Tolstoy's moral engines to Svetaeva's flames. Rick asked questions without pretense. She explained with patience, pressing him where he resisted. At the panel on crime and punishment, she said, Raskolnikov believed the rules didn't apply to him. The world is full of men like that. He held her gaze. And you think I'm one of them. I think you've been rewarded so consistently that you confuse outcomes with ethics. The words were blunt, but not cruel, placed in his hands like a stone. He didn't defend himself. For once, he let silence stand. I've been paid to be right for a long time, he said finally. It's a drug. Then consider this rehab with better lighting. Afterward, they sat with coffee by a tall window. She told stories of learning slang from sitcom reruns, of arguing with a teacher over adverbs. He admitted firing a man once simply because the word no unsettled him. They weren't confessions, exactly, more like sketches, traded carefully, a new language forming between them. When they parted, he only said, "Thank you for trusting me with an hour." 10 minutes, she corrected. You stole 50. Bill me, he said. I might. She hesitated. There's a Russian poetry night in the East Village, Wednesday. Don't sit in the front row. Don't network. I can be anonymous, he promised. You can try. As she descended the library, steps into the noise of Fifth Avenue, Rick realized the unfamiliar pressure in his chest wasn't conquest or possession. It was the raw, frightening desire to remain teachable in front of someone who didn't owe him a single lesson. Asterisk. Wednesday night in the East Village was nothing like Apex. The Poetry Cafe was narrow and dim. Folding chairs lined up in crooked rows. The smell of burnt espresso clinging to the air. A single microphone stood on a low wooden stage, its cord duct taped to the floor. Rick arrived early but chose a seat near the back, as instructed. He wore no suit, only a gray sweater and jeans, but still looked like someone who didn't belong, his posture too measured, his watch too sharp. Elena spotted him as she came in, carrying a worn leather satchel. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling free. She gave him the smallest nod, acknowledgement without invitation. Then she took a seat near the stage among a group of students who greeted her with hugs and familiarity. Rick felt an odd tug in his chest. Here, she was not a server, not even a stranger with sharp comebacks. She was part of a world that had nothing to do with him. The readings began. One by one, young voices, nervous, unpolished, stood and recited verses, some in Russian, most in English translations scribbled in notebooks. Some stumbled. Others soared. The room clapped after each piece, not out of politeness but solidarity. When Elena's turn came, she stepped to the microphone with a calm that silenced the chatter. She opened a notebook and began to read Akhmatova's Requiem in Russian first, her voice low and resonant, then in English translation. The words carried grief, defiance, the texture of history itself. Rick didn't understand the Russian, but he felt the rhythm, the pause before a knife of a line, the way her voice dropped as if pulling the whole room down with it. When she finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was reverent. She bowed slightly and returned to her seat, avoiding his eyes. Later in the cramped cafe corner, Rick approached her cautiously. "You moved the room," he said. "It wasn't me." "It was her," Elena replied, sliding her notebook back into her bag. Akhmatova knew what it meant to be silenced and to speak anyway. "You made us hear it," he countered. "Even me." For the first time, she allowed herself a smile that wasn't a weapon or a shield. "Maybe you listened." They walked out together into the neon-lit streets. Students laughed behind them, spilling into the night with cigarettes and cheap beer. A warm June breeze lifted Elena's hair as she looked up at the fire escapes and graffiti murals that marked the neighborhood. "Why do you come?" she asked suddenly. "Apex, the library here." "Why chase a world that was never yours?" Rick hesitated. Honesty felt heavier than any number he'd ever announced to a boardroom. "Because every time you speak, I hear something I didn't know I was missing. And I don't want to go back to silence." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for the performance she half expected. But his tone was stripped of polish. It was raw. "My life is complicated, Rick," she said finally. "My father is sick. My work is survival, not ambition. I don't have space for games. I don't want a game," he said. "I want the truth, yours, even if it's uncomfortable." They stopped at the corner of 2nd Avenue, where the streetlights threw long shadows across the pavement. Elena folded her arms, not defensive but steady. "My father has Parkinson's. The medications are expensive. Insurance covers little. That's why I work nights. So I can care for him during the day." Her voice was even, but the confession carried weight. Rick's instinct to offer solutions, money, specialists rose up immediately, and he had to bite it back. Instead, he said, "That must be exhausting." "It is." She looked at him carefully, measuring his reaction. "But it's mine. My choice. I don't need rescuing. I'm not here to rescue," he said softly. "I'm here because I care." That word hung between them, dangerous and fragile. Elena exhaled slowly, her expression softening for the briefest second before she stepped back. "Good night, Rick. Thank you for listening." She turned toward the subway entrance, descending into the rumble and heat. Rick stood above, watching until the last flicker of her dark hair disappeared into the tunnel. For once, he didn't feel in control of the outcome. He felt something rare, uncertain, unsteady, but undeniably alive. Back in his penthouse, the skyline glittered like trophies he'd already won. Yet all he could think about was the way Elena's voice had carried Akhmatova's grief into the air, and how, for the first time in years, he'd listened not as a man who conquered, but as one who learned. Sunday dinner at his mother's house had always been predictable. Polished silver, fresh-cut roses on the table, conversations trimmed to the bone like her cross-examinations in court. Cecilia Monroe, retired litigator, wore her 65 years with the poise of a queen and the sharpness of a scalpel. She had raised Rick on discipline, precision, and the quiet belief that emotions were liabilities best locked away. But that night she studied him with a piercing gaze and said, "You're different." Rick set down his glass of Bordeaux. "Different how?" "You're listening more. You're interrupting less. You even let your cousin tell you your projections were off last week. I haven't seen that since you were 16. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes searched. You've met someone. Rick nearly choked on the wine. That's quite a leap. It's observation. You don't shift by yourself. So who is she? He could have lied, deflected, changed the subject to quarterly numbers. But instead he heard himself say, "She's a server at Apex." His mother's eyebrows arched. A server? She's more than that, he said quickly. She has a degree in linguistics, almost finished a doctorate in comparative literature. Speaks 5 languages. Reads Russian poetry like it's oxygen. But yes, right now she waits tables. To take care of her father. He's sick. Cecilia leaned back, absorbing this with the calm of a judge considering evidence. And you, the man who buys and sells skyscrapers, are drawn to a woman who refuses to be bought or sold. Rick nodded, surprised at how accurate it sounded. Be careful, she warned, her tone gentler than he expected. If you treat her like a curiosity, you'll wound her and yourself. If you're serious, then for once in your life, you'll need to learn someone else's language without trying to rewrite it. Her words lingered like a verdict. The following night, Rick went back to Apex. When Elena approached, he noticed the weariness in her eyes, the slight drag in her shoulders. For the first time, he didn't see her as mysterious or untouchable. He saw her as tired human. Rough day? He asked. She hesitated, her professionalism pulling taut. It's fine. I don't believe you, he said softly. Can I help? Her eyes sharpened. Why do you care? He didn't prepare the answer. It came raw. Because I care about you. It stunned them both. Silence stretched, filled with the murmur of nearby tables and the clink of silverware. Finally she said, I don't need your pity. It's not pity, he insisted. It's interest. Real interest. She drew a breath, as if measuring whether to trust him. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, My father's Parkinson's is getting worse. The medication is crushing us financially. Insurance doesn't cover half of it. So I work nights. And days. And whatever else it takes. Rick's instinct to fix surged again. I can. No. Her voice was firm, cutting across his sentence like a blade. I don't want your money. I don't want your influence. I need respect, not rescue. The words hit harder than any boardroom defeat. He swallowed them, nodded, and let silence settle. At closing time he lingered, waiting near the entrance as Elena emerged in a simple coat, her hair tied back, her face pale with fatigue. Can I give you a ride home? He asked. It's late. The subway's fine, she said. It's already closed. She hesitated, then nodded once. Fine, just a ride. In the quiet of his car, city lights slipping past, she folded her arms and stared out the window. Rick gripped the wheel, hyper-aware of the fragile space between them. My offer doesn't come with strings, he said finally. I don't expect anything in return. I just want to be near you. She turned, meeting his eyes. You don't even know me. Then let me, he said. Give me that chance. The car slowed in front of her old brick apartment building. She reached for the door handle, paused, and said, There's an exhibit on Russian literature at the Museum of Language on Sunday morning. 10 o'clock. If you want to know me, meet me there. No suits, no chauffeur. Just you. And then she was gone, climbing the steps into the building, leaving him alone with the echo of her words. That night, Rick lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. He had closed billion-dollar deals, bought out rivals twice his size, walked into courtrooms where fortune swung on his testimony, yet nothing had ever felt as uncertain, as uncontrollable, or as vital as the possibility of Elena saying yes to letting him. The museum was already buzzing when Rick arrived 20 minutes early. The marble floors echoed with the shuffle of students, tourists, and academics speaking in low, reverent tones. Posters announced the special exhibition, Russian Letters, a century in translation. He wore jeans and a navy blazer, his hair deliberately less precise than usual, as if loosening his armor might help him blend in. It didn't. He still looked like a man used to commanding rooms instead of wandering through them. At exactly 10, Elena appeared. She wore a simple navy skirt, a white blouse, and let her dark hair fall loose over her shoulders. Without the server's vest, she seemed lighter, freer, though her eyes remained sharp. When they met his, he noticed a flicker of surprise, maybe even approval, that he had come alone. As promised. "You're early," she said. "In my world, being late costs millions." "Here," he stopped himself, then smiled faintly. "Here, it just means I wanted to be sure you'd see me waiting." Her lips curved, almost a smile. "Come on." They walked side by side into the exhibition hall. The first section displayed sepia-toned photographs of Russian immigrants, arriving in New York at the turn of the century, families clutching suitcases, children staring wide-eyed at a foreign skyline. Elena stopped in front of one. "My grandparents came like this," she said. "2 bags, one with clothes, the other with books. My grandfather used to tell me, language is the only country no one can steal." Rick looked at the worn faces in the photo, then at hers. For the first time, he realized how much weight a single sentence could carry when it was lived, not just spoken. Further along, they paused at a case devoted to Anna Akhmatova. Behind glass, a first edition translation sat open, her words preserved in fragile ink. "I read her last night," Rick said quietly. "I didn't understand everything, but I felt the way grief sharpens into something almost geometric." Elena turned to him, genuinely startled. "That's not bad," she said after a moment. "Even if you borrowed the geometry from your spreadsheets." He laughed softly. "Guilty." They lingered at a panel about Dostoevsky. A curator's note described Raskolnikov as a man who believed himself above ordinary morality, entitled to break rules because he considered himself extraordinary. "That belief has broken more lives than any war," Elena murmured. Then, looking directly at Rick, she added, "The world is full of men like that." He absorbed the blow, not as insult, but as truth. "And you think I'm one of them?" "I think you've been rewarded so consistently that you confuse outcomes with ethics," she said calmly. "That's not unusual. But it's dangerous." For once, he didn't argue. Instead, he let the silence hold. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "I've been paid to be right for so long, it's like a drug. Hard to imagine myself without it." "Then maybe this is rehab," she said, tilting her head toward the skylight, "with better lighting." By the time they reached the end of the exhibit, the museum cafe beckoned with the smell of coffee and pastries. They found a small table by the window, the city flowing past outside. "Why Apex?" he asked. "With your education, you could be lecturing at Columbia, editing books, doing anything but pouring wine for men like me." Her expression shuddered for a moment. "Because life required money now. Academia offers maybes years from now. My father needed medicine. Night shifts let me care for him in the day." Rick nodded slowly. For once, he didn't offer solutions, didn't flash resources like keys to a locked door. "That must be a lot." "It is," she admitted, stirring her coffee. "But it's mine. My choice. I don't regret it. What should I read next?" he asked, surprising himself with the eagerness in his voice. She studied him carefully, then said, "Akhmatova's Requiem. Not to quote at dinners. Read it so you understand what it costs to speak truth. Then Chekhov's stories about men who disappoint. And Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. That one hurts in all the useful ways." "I'll read them," Rick promised. "Read them twice," she corrected. "Once with your mind. Once with whatever part of you still believes you can change." They talked another half hour. About sitcoms that taught her slang. About the arrogance he once mistook for leadership. When they finally rose, he wanted to ask for more, to claim another day, but instead he said simply, "Thank you for giving me this hour." 10 minutes, she said, though a trace of warmth flickered in her eyes. "You stole 50. Bill me," he replied with a grin. "I might." She hesitated, then added, "There's a poetry reading in the village on Wednesday. Folding chairs, bad coffee. If you come, don't sit in the front row. Don't network. Just listen. I can be anonymous," he said. "You can try," she answered. And for the first time, her laughter was unguarded. Rick stood outside the museum as she disappeared into the crowd. The lions carved in stone seemed to watch him, measuring whether he could be the man he was pretending to become. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invincible. He felt something far rarer, unsure, unsteady, but willing to learn. The fallout came faster than Rick expected. By the end of the week, a business column in the Wall Street Journal ran a piece titled, "Is Rick Monroe Losing His Edge?" It cited anonymous insiders whispering about canceled meetings, unexplained absences, and a sudden fascination with Russian poetry. His competitors smelled weakness. His board members smelled risk. The company stock dipped 3 points in one day. Fernando, his CFO of 15 years, stormed into his office with 2 other directors in tow. "What the hell is happening to you, Rick? We're about to close the biggest deal of our history, and you're spending your nights in cafes and libraries." Rick leaned back, calm but firm. "The deal with the Singapore fund is secure. I'm not walking away, I'm rebalancing." "Rebalancing?" Fernando snapped. "You're distracted. The shareholders are restless. And now the press is circling like sharks. All because of some..." He stopped himself, but the contempt lingered in the air. Rick's eyes sharpened. "Finish the sentence." Fernando hesitated. "All because of some woman. A server. That's what people are saying." Rick stood, his voice iron. "Her name is Elena, and what's happening in my life is mine to decide. The numbers are solid. The contracts are moving. This company is stable. If the board doubts me, let them call a vote." Silence fell. The directors glanced at one another, unnerved. Rick rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it was final. That night, needing air, he went to Elena's apartment in Brooklyn. She opened the door in a simple sweater, her hair pulled back, the faint smell of tea and old books drifting into the hallway. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "The press has already taken enough pictures of you walking into this building. My neighbors whisper. My father sees headlines. Do you know what it feels like to have your life turned into someone else's narrative? I know what it feels like to be treated as if you're nothing more than your wealth," he said. "But you're right. I dragged you into this spotlight. I didn't think what it would cost you." Her father's voice drifted from the living room. "Let him in, Lena. I want to meet the man who makes the newspapers chase us." Rick stepped inside. The apartment was modest but alive, shelves bending with books, a piano tucked into the corner, family photographs on the walls. In an armchair sat Mikhail Sokolov, thin from illness but with eyes bright and alert. A wool blanket covered his knees, and a thick Russian novel rested on his lap. "So," the older man said in accented English, smiling faintly, "this is the Wolf of Wall Street who thinks he can understand Tolstoy." Rick chuckled nervously. "Trying to, sir." "Good. Trying is the beginning of all wisdom," Mikhail said. Then his expression turned sharp. "But tell me, do you seek my daughter as a conquest or as a companion? Because if it is conquest, you will fail. She is not for men who play games." Elena flushed. "Papa, no," he interrupted. "This must be asked." His gaze bored into Rick's. Rick swallowed hard. "I don't want her as a conquest. I want her as herself. She doesn't bend, doesn't flatter, doesn't let me hide behind numbers. She makes me face myself. That's more than I ever thought I needed. Or deserved." Mikhail studied him for a long, uncomfortable silence, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you are not entirely hopeless." Elena's lips curved despite herself. Over the following weeks, Rick's life became a balancing act. Days in glass towers, nights in poetry cafes. Shareholder calls interrupted by hospital visits for Mikhail. Board members whispering about recklessness, while Elena pushed him to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and loneliness. One evening, walking along the East River, Elena stopped him with a question. "Why do you keep coming back? After the press, the board, the pressure, why not walk away from me?" Rick looked out at the water, the city's glow painting ripples of gold. "Because all my life, I thought power was about making people bend, but you're the first person who never bent, and instead, you made me want to stand straighter. That's not something I can walk away from." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Then she reached for his hand, not tentative, not fleeting, but steady. It was the smallest gesture. Yet for Rick Monroe, the man who once believed he was above every rule, it was the first time he felt what it meant to belong to something greater than himself. And for Elena, it was the first time she allowed herself to believe that someone might see her, not as a mystery to be solved, not as a burden to be pitied, but as a partner to be honored. The city stretched endlessly around them, but in that quiet moment by the river, both felt it narrow to the space between two clasped hands, an uncertain, fragile, but undeniable beginning. The headlines did not relent. Every morning, Rick found his name splashed across business columns and gossip blogs alike. Monroe's mysterious distraction. From boardroom to book readings. The billionaire and the waitress. Paparazzi lingered outside Apex, prowled near Elena's apartment, and even once trailed them down the steps of a Brooklyn subway station. Elena endured it with a quiet strength, but Rick could see the toll in the tightening of her jaw, the way she flinched when cameras flashed in her direction. One evening, in her modest apartment, she snapped a magazine shut and tossed it onto the coffee table. Her own face stared back at her from the cover, beneath a headline dripping with innuendo. "This is unbearable," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I didn't ask for this life. Rick, I didn't sign up to be dissected like some scandalous novelty." Rick sat beside her, feeling helpless. "It will pass. The media cycle moves quickly. You've lived in it your whole life. You know how to play this game. But me, I wanted quiet. I wanted to be invisible except for the work that mattered." She buried her face in her hands. "Now I'm a caricature, the poor Russian waitress who caught the Wolf of Wall Street." Before Rick could respond, Mikhail's voice carried from his chair in the corner. "Then write your own story." Both turned to him. His eyes, weakened by illness, still gleamed with intensity. "You cannot stop them from talking, Lena, but you can drown them with your truth. Finish your book. Show them who you are, beyond their headlines." Elena blinked. "Papa, you've been carrying those pages in your head for years." "It's time." Rick leaned forward, seizing on the thought. "He's right. You once told me about the project you abandoned, an analysis of Russian literature's influence on American intellectual life. Why not now? Why not reclaim the narrative?" Elena stared between the two men, conflicted. "Even if I did, who would publish me? No one takes a server at Apex seriously." "I know someone," Rick admitted. "Carlos Vega runs one of the biggest publishing houses. He admired your father's translations. I can introduce you. No strings. The rest would be up to your work." Elena's eyes narrowed. "And that's not just another way for you to fix my life with your power?" He held her gaze. "It's not fixing. It's opening a door. Walking through it would be entirely yours." Mikhail nodded slowly. "Pride is a luxury, Lena. Talent without a platform is a candle in a sealed box. Let him help you lift the lid." Elena looked down at her hands, silent for a long time. Finally she whispered, "I'll think about it." 2 weeks later, in a quiet corner of a publisher's office, Elena sat across from Carlos Vega, The editor was a gray-haired man with sharp glasses, and the kind of enthusiasm that couldn't be faked. He flipped through the proposal she'd prepared, notes scrawled late at night, fragments of essays resurrected from old folders. "This isn't just scholarship," Carlos said, looking up. "It's urgent. You're drawing lines between Russian exiles and American thought that no one else has mapped. We could publish this as an academic edition and a popular one. It will take discipline, years of work. But it's brilliant." For the first time in weeks, Elena's guarded face softened. "You mean it?" "I wouldn't waste my time if I didn't," Carlos replied. "But the choice is yours. Are you ready to step into the light?" Elena glanced at Rick, who had remained silent in the corner, careful not to overshadow the moment. He only nodded once, as if to say, "This is yours." She drew a breath. "Yes, I'm ready." The following months reshaped both their lives. By day, Rick juggled board meetings, investor calls, and the scrutiny of directors still wary of his distraction. By night, he often sat across from Elena at the long wooden table in her apartment, drafts of chapters spread out between mugs of tea. Sometimes Mikhail offered sharp critiques. Other times he simply listened, pride flickering in his tired eyes. Rick read passages aloud, stumbling over Russian names, and Elena corrected his pronunciation with patient amusement. For the first time in years, he felt like a student, awkward, eager, unpolished. One evening, after hours of revisions, Elena looked at him across the clutter of papers. "Why do you keep helping me like this?" "It's not your world," Rick hesitated, then answered with a truth that surprised even himself. "Because in your words, I've found something I never found in numbers, meaning, and because with you, I'm not the man who has to win every room. I'm just a me." Elena held his gaze, her defenses lowering inch by inch. "Then don't betray that, Rick. Not for me. Not for yourself." In the quiet that followed, their hands met across the papers. No negotiation, no performance, just two people choosing, against all odds, to walk into the uncertain future together. And somewhere in the shadows of the city outside, the story of the billionaire and the waitress began to shed its cliches and turn into something far rarer. A partnership built not on rescue or conquest, but on respect, resilience, and the possibility of love strong enough to rewrite the narrative.